Hey, you right, everyone. So I'm here with Lynn tonight. I've known Lynn for many years, and Lynn has got a very unique set of experience and knowledge around sectors related to homelessness. So I'll let Lynn introduce herself properly in a moment. But basically, what you tend to find in the sector is that people tend to stay within their little silos, whether it be social workers or housing workers or whatever. And actually, to get good outcomes, you often need to know a little bit more than just your own little patch. So Lynn's knowledge crosses various patches basically, and so we're just going to talk, have a bit of conversation, looking at modern slavery and kind of exploitation of kids and stuff, and how that can be reduced and whatever, and I guess how that also impacts on homelessness law, homelessness itself, and so on. So, Lynn, do you want to say a bit more than I just said about kind of what your background is and stuff, and yeah, where you're coming from?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. So I've been practicing I've been a practitioner around safeguarding of children and adults from probably about the mid 80s. Most of my initial experience came from working within the police and public protection teams. So that essentially meant that I was working in child protection, adult safeguarding, domestic abuse, and serious sexual violence type of teams. And I worked within the police for about 20 years. I then became an independent safeguarding trainer. Around about the time that adult safeguarding really started to kind of become the way it is today, because prior to that time, it was a bit of a postcode lottery. So started out initially as an independent safeguarding trainer consultant, working with a whole range of different practitioners, providing them with training and consultancy. Um, I've worked on some historical abuse inquiries. I've worked with yourselves, with Just Us, supporting individuals who'd been made homeless due to domestic abuse. And within all of that, I've also worked with a couple of charities supporting children and adults who've been exploited through modern slavery, human trafficking. So I've got quite a varied kind of experience in terms of safeguarding, abuse generally. And some of those pieces of work have involved face-to-face work with individuals, and some of it has been, as it is at the moment, is mostly around supporting practitioners to help them to understand a bit more about legislation and policy.
Cool. Thanks, Lynn. And I think there's a number of things we could talk about. I think tonight we're going to just kind of focus on modern slavery. And I notice it might, you're probably like just kind of tired of just kind of repeating the same mantra, but I think it's probably useful for you to explain just the basics around modern slavery, because I think it's a word, term we hear in the press quite a bit, I guess, but I don't know it's something we really necessarily understand in any detail. So I just thought it might be interesting just to kind of get that sort of base level,
Yeah.
what are we actually talking about here, and I think we can then sort of build from there to look at some more interesting questions.
No problem at all. And I don't mind explaining it because even today, I was training some safeguarding managers who assumed that human trafficking only occurred when people were physically moved long distances in and out of the country or long distances between cities. So those people that you might expect would understand it don't either. So I really don't mind explaining it. First of all, modern slavery, the Modern Slavery Act as we know it today, is this year, it's its 10th year anniversary. And yet there are still many practitioners that don't quite understand what it means in its practical application. And there are lots of different ways in which we can disrupt and safeguard using a range of civil orders. And again, that's something that is not commonly known about. And so that's a kind of another journey that's going on at the moment. But when we talk about modern slavery, we talk about different forms of exploitation. Commonly, the most typical forms of exploitation are sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, forced labor. They are the most common. But we also have other forms of slavery and servitude within that, that could be domestic servitude, for example. We also have different forms of exploitation that can involve financial exploitation. And when we talk about human trafficking, that's also part of the modern slavery legislation. And in essence, any movement, so that movement could be by being physically moved or where someone facilitates the movement or the travel of another person for the purposes of exploitation is human trafficking. There is case law to support even movement within the same building from one room to another, if it's for the purposes of exploitation, is human trafficking. So I want to dispel the myth that human trafficking only happens to people that come into the UK, go out of the UK. Yes, it can be, but more commonly, human trafficking are people that live, maybe have been born in this country, and are exploited within the same country, even within the same town, the same road, the same street. And it's not always identified as trafficking.
That's so. That's I'm learning stuff already. I know that I don't want to throw you under the bus. I know that a lot of your work kind of involves essentially working with professionals who will see the victim as a perpetrator or see them as a criminal,
Mhm.
and because often they are committing crime on behalf of the kind of people who are controlling them. I mean, how do you kind of tackle that in terms of when you work with social workers or police officers or other sectors, antisocial behaviour teams? I imagine probably quite bad at this. How do you kind of challenge them and say you're looking at the wrong person, or you're looking at it from the wrong perspective here? You're actually potentially penalising the victim here. As you say, I guess in the cases you're coming across, often it'll be young people. But how do you have those conversations, and kind of how does that go down? Do people kind of hear that kind of challenge, or do they kind of just still kind of continue and continue to sort of see them as the baddies?
I think it depends, Mike. It depends who it is, depends on the context of it. And one thing I really try to do is encourage a mentality of educating rather than challenging, because I think if you're feeling that you're having an opportunity to be educated and upskilled, feels slightly less threatening than if we talk about challenging. But I know exactly what you're saying, and in effect, that's what a lot of my work is. Um, I would say that in the first instance, when I kind of explain things in a nuts and bolts way, often I don't have to say anything else. The person I'm speaking to, you can almost see those cogs are working and they're kind of going, it's exploitation, isn't it? I don't even have to say it. I kind of just say, could you just tell me a little bit about the scenario and just so that I can understand it so that we can consider whether or not there may be exploitation. So I often come at it from that direction. I ask them to sort of help me understand it. And in the same way, that penny drops in most cases, not always. Um, I think one of the most important things around the modern slavery legislation is something called the National Referral Mechanism, commonly called the NRM. And actually, most people, I say most people, a lot of practitioners I speak to will look at the NRM and say, well, it's really not very important. It's just a data gathering tool. And I would completely disagree with that. Yes, it is important in my view. And yes, it is a data gathering tool, but it's not just a data gathering tool. And if I just explain a bit more about that, and it kind of links into the reason that I'm here to talk to you today around homelessness, is that by using the National Referral Mechanism, the NRM, for children, you do not need a child's consent. Okay, so once a social worker, police officer, law enforcement officer, whether that be a border force person or whoever, National Crime Agency, once they are suspecting that that child is a victim of slavery, is being exploited, then their statutory duty is to make a referral through the NRM. So when we make a referral that goes through to the Secretary of State, it's not the Secretary of State that looks at it per se. It's a team, it's a unit on behalf of the Secretary of State. Will then evaluate the evidence and consider whether or not at that moment there are reasonable grounds to suspect that they can't prove that they suspect that that child has been exploited. And exactly the same system happens for an adult, except for an adult, you need their consent to refer them to the NRM. So that first stage test is just that very beginning of that journey to evaluate evidence, to collect evidence. And it's the second stage, the what we call the conclusive ground stage, that will be important from a housing perspective, but it also reminds all of those practitioners that are working with that adult or that child that regardless of what type of exploitation, regardless of whether they have been manipulated and coerced into committing criminal offences, they are still a victim of modern slavery. And it is not by any means a get out of jail free card, because many people often refer to it as that. It's not that, but it can serve to mitigate and to highlight that this child, this adult, has only been involved in that type of exploitation. And this is commonly the issue with criminal exploitation, not so much with sexual, because I think with sexual exploitation, we immediately have that empathy, that kind of want to protect. But with criminal exploitation, we see a very different perspective, because we just see children, adolescents who are not always considered as children, young adolescents, little thugs creating mayhem. Well, they are children until they reach the age of 18. And we need to see them as children. We need to recognize their vulnerability as children. And that's part of the role of the NRM.
And so you kind of, I mean, the threshold you're talking about there, so there's the kind of the initial stage and then the second stage, that seems to kind of mirror homelessness law in the sense that, the initial duties are triggered if there's reasons they might be homeless, and then, they actually have to work out if they are. What
Yeah.
kind of difficulties are there, or let me rephrase that, how easy is it for that second stage to be satisfied that that person is in fact a victim of modern slavery? I mean, what kind of evidential basis is used? Is it kind of intel they've gathered from police and agencies? I mean, how far do they go? Because I'm kind of anticipating the question that's going to come next, which is where housing teams will essentially say, we don't believe you. We don't think there's actually enough evidence here to prove this person is homeless because of the abuse they're suffering. So I just wondered, it might be helpful just to kind of understand how the Secretary of State's team is kind of arriving at that conclusion.
Mm. Again, it's a bit of a depends answer, Mike. It's not straightforward, because some areas are what we call devolved pilot areas. So they have a panel of professionals, which will be made up of a whole range of people from public protection backgrounds and exploitation backgrounds, and their decision making is often a lot quicker than when it goes through what's called the single competent authority, that bigger authority. Depending on which area you're in the country will depend on whether or not there's a devolved pilot. It's not actually standard throughout the country at the moment. We hope that it will be, because it will speed things up. The answer to the question is that this is on the balance of probability. This is a civil burden of proof. This is not a criminal burden of proof, as most things are a civil burden of proof. And yet, I still see that expectation of, yes, but it's not at that criminal threshold. So therefore, we shouldn't be making an NRM. But the minute we have a reasonable cause to suspect that they are either at risk of, or that they are being victimized, they are being exploited, then what will happen is either the devolved pilot or the single competent authority, the SCA, will ask for more information. And this is where that partnership element of safeguarding comes into its own, because we can't just rely on one agency to provide all of the information. So we would go to our community support officers, we would go to our police officers, our social care professionals, anyone that has information that will aid in filling those gaps in intelligence can be submitted to be part of that process of evaluation. The NRM is not the same as looking to prosecute someone for a criminal offence. It's not the same burden of proof. One thing I can say, though, is that there have been situations where in an area in the south of the country where there were a group of children that were all being targeted, manipulated, and exploited, they actually used the fact that there were more than 20 children and vulnerable adults that had NRMs that were all connected to this one suspect. And even though they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute at that point, excuse me, they had enough information to be able to apply for a civil order, a slavery trafficking risk order, which again is a civil order, it's a civil burden of proof. And they were able to use that information as well as other information from other agencies to apply for that order. And that order is a means to which we can disrupt and protect people, even if they haven't been prosecuted.
So that's kind of one example of how the NRM can result in some concrete help to reduce the risk to the people who are being exploited. I
Yeah.
mean, what other kinds of outcomes might there be? So I mean, I'm sure a lot of it is going to kind of is going to rest with the kind of partnership agencies. The other agencies are also working with individuals, but what kind of other good outcomes can you get out of it, if it kind of if there's enough evidence and if it kind of falls into place?
So if the NRM conclusive grounds have been met, um, one of the things that can be really helpful is within the Code of Guidance around homelessness, we have Chapter 25, which is specifically around children or people who are fleeing because of modern slavery. And a conclusive grounds decision, NRM, is mentioned within that guidance, that will serve towards them being potentially in priority need. It's not automatic priority need, but certainly would serve to show that they've got a priority need. And as with many other aspects of homelessness, that in that particular case, they don't have to prove that they have a local connection because in many ways they don't want a local connection. That's the whole point of it. But I guess one of the issues and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you and to speak to everyone that's able to watch this is that housing officers very often don't know about this particular part of homelessness law and practice. A lot of social care professionals don't know either. And I've had, well, you know, because I've consulted with you, Mike, but I've had in excess of five queries that have come up through my role in the charity that I'm working with at the moment, where there's been clear evidence that the social care professional that's contacted the housing officer around how can we protect this family that are subject to modern slavery, the answer's been, well, you need to go on the list and you'll have to wait like everyone else, or you haven't got a local connection in that area. So so having the NRM and being able to then signpost them to that guidance and how that can then help them is often a really helpful way to get that conversation opened and for them to become more aware of that too.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's helpful to introduce a kind of a hypothetical situation just to kind of see how these different moving parts might operate. So let's say we've got a family living in an area, lived there all, lived there for a long time, and let's say one of the children is subject to exploitation and is kind of targeted, and let's say it's criminal exploitation. Let's say they start to deliver drugs for a dealer or something like that,
Yeah.
and there's violence involved, there's threats involved, and at some point it either becomes either the young person wants to exit it, or whether professional services become aware of it and they kind of get involved and go down this route of investigating. Now, in that kind of situation, you've got a young person who is probably, well, may well be homeless. We obviously kind of depends on the facts, but is likely to be in priority need, as you say. It's, in some cases, it won't be automatic. But you potentially also got the other family members who may also be targeted by the organised criminals and whatever, and so they too might be homeless as well. And I guess it kind of lots of different things can happen, but I think that just the way that it can have that kind of ripple effect can obviously be fairly pressing for the family. But I guess that means that the council would potentially, or a council potentially, would owe a duty to both the young person and the family, whether or
Sure.
not the young person wants to stay with the family or whatever. But that's one of the ways this can kind of as I say, ripple out and kind of cause a lot of disruption to other people. So
And
is the work you're supporting effectively just supporting the actual person who's been exploited, or are you also looking at the kind of the wider family, the wider the social
uh,
circumstances?
I would say all of the above, actually, Mike. So
Yeah,
I don't work directly with families or the children or the young adults, but I do work directly with as a critical friend, I support the practitioners around that child or around that family. And the kind of examples you've given are the very typical examples. where the family need to get away because they just cannot see any other way of getting their child, their young adult, out of that circle, that cycle of exploitation, unless they physically move away. And those are the most typical scenarios. And of course, as you know, the guidance and the whole kind of conversation around modern slavery isn't just about the person. It will involve the family, the whole family. And I've seen families torn apart because of what's happened, and they feel like they've lost their 15-year-old, because she has been exploited by an organized gang. They go missing from home. They're absent from school. School then say, we don't want you, which is exactly what the exploiters want, because they're rubbing their hands, because now they've got the child at their beck and call every minute of the day. They don't have to make allowances for school hours. So there are so many dynamics, there are so many parts of this kind of big jigsaw puzzle that make a big picture where everyone is likely to be involved, whether they like it or not. And certainly one of the cases I know that you've had some involvement with, Mike, which has always really stuck with me, was a woman who was she was a nursing sister at a hospital. Husband was an accountant. Their two boys went to a local school. Both boys doing well at school, doing well at sport. There was no concerns about them whatsoever. And then one of them, the older boy, when he was 16, he took a job during the holiday period. And it was at that point that he was then exploited. The way that children, adults get exploited, it's a repertoire, and I don't know if anyone has seen on ITV at the moment, there is a drama with Martin Clunes. I think it's called Out There. If any of you get a chance to look at it, it is the model of how children are exploited. Oh, look after this for me. Then it goes missing. Well, now you owe me, and now you've got to pay for it. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen. And in this instance, that's kind of what happened. And the exploiter wasn't the person that was at the end of the chain. They were another person that had been exploited. But, they showed this lad, this 16-year-old, pictures of his mum coming out of the hospital from work, dad going to work, the car registration number, his 14-year-old brother going to school with his mates. So they didn't really have to say very much except to say, we're watching you. We know what you're up to. Cutting a very long story short, he ended up being exploited for 2 years. He went missing on and off for 2 years. He eventually managed to escape, and then he talked about how every day he'd had a loaded gun held to his head, how he'd been sexually violated, he'd been forced to do things that he didn't want to do, all to coerce and control him. And he couldn't contact his family. And when he did finally escape and got to his family, within 24 hours, the gang were at the door, macheteing down the front door. The police were really not interested. By now, he was 18. He was seen as someone who would not engage with social services, apart from the fact he knew that if he spoke to a social worker, his mum would be threatened with being abused and assaulted. So, of course, he wasn't going to talk to a social worker. But his records show he didn't engage with social worker. He was absent from school. I don't need to say anymore. It's the same old, same old, same old. And as a result of that, the kind of response was, and the housing officer in that case, when mum made an application to say we need to get away, the housing officer's response was, well, is your 18-year-old son talking to the police? Is he telling them who's exploited him? And she said, no. Well, has he given his phone to give them evidence so they can prosecute these people? No. Well, if he really was being, and you can just imagine the conversation, and this conversation, not only was it directed at mum on the phone, but it was then directed at the social care team manager when she was on the phone. The insults and the language that the housing team used to mum and to the professional. At one point, they were talking to her 18-year-old, the mum was with her son, talking to him on her phone, and they were so abusive to him on the phone. She took the phone away and said, you will not speak to my son. You speak to me. It was horrific. But after all of that, Mike, eventually they did recognize that they were in the wrong, that they had a duty to this family, not only because of the modern slavery aspect, but also because there was a child still in that household. Um, and they were provided with the right accommodation in the right place to get away. But their life has been torn apart. She's had to leave her job, her marriage has broken up, her 14-year-old son can't have any contact with his friends, they can't go on social media. Their whole life is now having to be built up from the ground up. And the kind of response that they had, particularly from housing, was one of the worst I've ever seen. But thank goodness the social workers stood firm and they got the result. But it's not a happy ever after ending. It never will be. But just in that moment, to have that support, to have that chance to move, will have saved their lives.
So as you know, I can talk at length about poor housing officers. But I mean, obviously, there's good housing officers out there as well. And I just wonder. So you kind of mentioned actually where you've got someone who's been exploited through childhood, but then they reach their 18th birthday and are then regarded differently, and they're no longer automatically in priority needs, and so on. Is it? I mean, I guess it might just be useful because when we talk about priority need through vulnerability, we're talking about things which may be obvious, physical disabilities, but we're also, I mean, the whole kind of the language of the law and the fact that they're talking about different kinds of abuse, the fact that they include modern slavery within the kind of one of the listed characteristics. Obviously, when a housing officer is speaking, no matter how good a housing officer they are, when they're speaking to a young person who might have been exploited, it's a whole different world that young person is going to be coming from, the young adult.
Mm.
But I guess it's just probably even just what you said there in terms of the kinds of things they will be experiencing that's wrapped up in that experience of being exploited are clearly going to have long-term psychological kind of impacts on them.
Mm.
And I just want to, I mean, it might be not worth kind of adding to what you just said, because I think what you just said is kind of, it's probably enough to infer what we're talking about here. But when professionals of any kind of, whichever sector they're in, when they're dealing with someone who has been exploited, I guess the person themselves are unlikely to say much about the experience for various reasons, not just the fact that they might be scared to be seen as a grass or whatever, but because they're often asked these questions in an open plan customer service center, there's no way they're going to get that kind of honesty. But I just
No.
wonder, like, I think it seems to be safe to certainly have that line of thinking where you're dealing with that sort of person, the person from that sort of situation, that they are likely to be or may well have traumatic kind of psychological effects from that some stuff. And I guess it should be an invitation for the housing officer or whoever to show themselves trustworthy, build up rapport, and kind of, but again, not expect them to, as you say, kind of report things to the police, or the fact they haven't done that sort of thing to then kind of try and use against them. So yeah, I might not have a question in that actually. I just think just reflecting on what you just said,
Mm.
but it seems that as professionals, when we're dealing with that kind of situation, we
It's
should be
about that
inquisitive.
trauma. One of the difficulties that also comes up, and it's not specific to housing, but it does have repercussions in terms of what care and support they might receive and how they might be seen as being in need of care and support, is the Section 42 criteria for the Care Act and those adults transitioning. So I was just going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, okay. Um, well, yeah, I mean, okay. So we've just talked. We kind of briefly talked about kind of how that sort of experience might render someone vulnerable. I mean, other in terms of the kind of the adult safeguarding stuff that's going to kick in and the adult social care that might be available. Again, I'd imagine quite a few people in that situation wouldn't obviously have care and support needs, but there might be some that are a little bit more hidden, and I guess safeguarding is often going to be involved. So, how
Mm.
can the adult safeguarding process help people in that situation, and kind of, I guess, keep people safe if they do resettle? What can be done to kind of ensure that they remain safe going forward and can rebuild?
Yeah. Well, it's again, that's a really interesting question. And again, it's a bit of a depends. It depends on where you live. It depends on what local authority is kind of has the authority in that area, if you like. So some local authorities are extremely good at understanding and recognizing that even though a person, let's say a young adult who's transitioned from 18 into adulthood, who's been a victim of exploitation, who might have also experienced some pretty awful childhood stuff as well. So often they go hand in hand, not always, but that's pretty typical in most cases. Um, and in fact, that's one of the reasons I've watched and heard and spoken to a lot of people who've been in gangs and have now come out and have talked to gang leaders, and they will say that the things that they look out for when they're looking to target and manipulate and groom a child into exploitation or a young adolescent into exploitation, they look out for those added vulnerability factors. So they look out for children who are in single parent families. They look out for children where there's extreme poverty. They look out for children who there's no father figure, there's no role model, if you like, in their life, where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse. I mean, my goodness, all those things I've just mentioned, you could probably say, my God, that's pretty much every client I work with. Um, so they know what to look out for. They look for children specifically. And I can send you the link. There's a pretty chilling video of one of these guys who's now a mentor talking to a gang leader. And he says, well, so what age are we talking about? Are we talking school age? And he says, school age are the best because they want money. And the way this guy talks about the way he manipulates children it chills your blood. But those children that maybe have already gone through some of those experiences, who are then seen as easy targets to be exploited. So not only have they gone through the trauma perhaps of domestic abuse, violence, etc., in a household, they're now tied into that cycle of being abused and manipulated by someone who pretends that they're their mate, and then of course they eventually realize that they're not. So that child then turns 18, goes into adulthood. They may have been a child who's been looked after. They may have been a child in foster care, any of those scenarios. And then, of course, they turn 18 and children's services say, thanks a lot, off you go now. And then adult services will say, well, you're not physically disabled. You don't meet the criteria for an assessment under the Care Act. So therefore, why would we suppose that you've got a need for care and support in terms of adult safeguarding criteria? And again, this is where it becomes quite complicated, because the Care Act was never written to say that someone who has a need for care and support in safeguarding terms has to have an eligible need under the Care Act. But somehow, somewhere along the road, that became twisted and manipulated. And not all, but some local authorities will look at that person and say, you don't have an eligible need for care and support, therefore adult safeguarding doesn't apply to you. But there are some very good local authorities who completely get it and completely understand that a child going into adulthood who has experienced all that trauma, whether they've had adverse childhood experiences or not, they will have experienced trauma. And the example I gave with the lad who had the gun held to his head, I won't go into graphic detail. It was horrific. And he came from a lovely childhood background. His mother didn't recognize him. He was a shell of a person when he came back after 2 years. And thank goodness the local authority in the area where they wanted to move to was one of those local authorities who immediately understood that the nature of that trauma had a profound impact on him. Therefore, he had a need for care and support. They needed to do something. But without getting too far down a rabbit hole in terms of the Care Act, one of the other conversations that I frequently have with social care professionals is, even if you don't think that that person meets the criteria under Section 42, which is the section within the Care Act, Section 1 of the Care Act reminds us that there is a statutory duty to promote well-being. And one of those elements of well-being includes protection from abuse and neglect. So whichever way you look at it, if a person is displaying those signs of trauma and from the exploitation that they've experienced as they go into adulthood, and they clearly need some support, and again, I hear on a daily basis almost workers who are so support workers often, not social care workers so much, but youth workers support charities who are supporting young adults who say to me, look, they might have mental capacity, they might be assessed as having the mental capacity to make these decisions, but their executive functioning has been massively affected by their understanding of the decisions that they're making. And that is not taken into consideration. So one example recently was a support worker from a charity who contacted me in the charity that I'm working in and said, this young woman, she's 20, she's had a whole childhood of being abused by her family. She then was exploited. Her mother sort of placed her in the arms practically of her drug dealer, who then exploited this girl. And as a child and as an adult now, she is now doing sex work. And even though that might be her choice, that has clearly been impacted by what happened in her childhood. And within the context of that, she takes a lot of risks around. She doesn't have protected sex. She goes into situations that are extremely dangerous. She is regularly assaulted and raped and beaten up. And sometimes the worker said, the police have said, well, she's a sex worker. What do you want me to do about it? And then that's another conversation, which I won't get into because we'll be here all night. But the fact of the matter is, she is making some very dangerous, very unwise decisions. And they're saying, well, she's got mental capacity. We've assessed her capacity. But they haven't assessed her executive functioning. And executive functioning is affected, or her functioning, her ability to make decisions, massively affected by trauma that's not being taken into consideration. So adult safeguarding team in that particular area, and I won't name and shame them, although I'd very much like to, are basically saying we have no responsibility to her, no duty to her. They're just not getting it. And she is now street homeless because there's been issues around people at the house and, tenancy because of drug users, etc., etc. And she is one of the most vulnerable people that we should be protecting, and we shouldn't be judging, and we shouldn't be just looking at that situation. Oh, well, she's got capacity, and she's not disabled, she's perfectly. It's not about that, Mike. And that's the most frustrating element, I think, is trying to educate those individuals who are in those positions that can do something, and in a way that they will really get it and they'll really understand. So all we can keep doing is educating, challenging. Yeah, we may have to challenge, but educate if we can as well.
Yeah, yeah. That's all really, really helpful. Yeah, I may pull you back in at some point and then to do another video, kind of just on some stuff. But I think that's really useful for today. I think that kind of gives us a bit of kind of well, just looking at it from a number of different angles. And I guess I've maybe got one final question, which would be where a good social work team has accepted that they do have duty to someone in that situation, what kinds of things can they do that are actually going to help? Because obviously, the lady you mentioned probably is not going to be particularly, keen on engaging with a traditional social work session or something, at a set time on some office somewhere. But what kinds of things can they do? I mean, in one sense, the social work team can obviously be very crucial in getting her housed through the Housing Act and advocating for her in that sense. But are there other things which you've seen which actually do help people and do kind of put people in a better position than they were when they started out?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some amazing good practice around the country, Mike. So I don't want to paint the picture that this is countrywide, but these examples, as I say, are, I hope, helpful for people to kind of understand the dynamic that we're talking about, and how people can use the law in a way that can be really unhelpful, if you like, or interpret it in a way that's unhelpful. But yeah, I've seen some amazing work. And in fact, in that example that I've just given you, that has done a complete 360, in as much that the local authority in that area have finally accepted that they have a duty to support her, and therefore they are looking at investing in providing her with a variety of therapeutic services, trauma-informed therapeutic services, allowing her or inviting her to build a relationship with a support worker who's got knowledge around the whole kind of subject area, if you like, that we're dealing with here. Um, And I've heard that she is starting to make some really positive gains in that respect. But certainly, when we're looking at investment in using the safeguarding process, we're then looking at whether that person has access to other services that they might not otherwise be offered or that might not be resourced through the local authority. So, often people, if they can't afford it, they won't get anything. Whereas through the safeguarding process, there are ways and means in which we can engage with health professionals, therapeutic services, youth justice services have a variety of partners, community partnership. They have some amazing things that they can offer to support people. So, for example, and I will say this area, in Blackpool, the community safety officers up there are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. They use the antisocial behaviour legislation, the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act, to use community protection warnings and notices to support people. They invest in a £15 package, will give you the equivalent of a kind of Ring doorbell, some security cameras, so that they can be put onto the person's house so that they don't have to be the one calling the police and reporting it when there's a breach. They will then get the evidence from the cameras. And they've had something like an 85% success rate in that area around safety, safeguarding, with people being able to kind of get their lives back on track, particularly where you've got individuals where, they're being cuckooed, they're being taken advantage of, they lose their tenancy because of that. So they're finding lots of really creative and innovative ways to safeguard people without those people feeling like, well, if I report, I'm going to be seen as a grass, I'm going to be facing the repercussions. The community safety officers absolutely deal with it. And they're like, this person doesn't have a choice. This is what we're going to do. And it's been amazing. So there are some really amazing pieces of practice around the country. It's just the same. It's just a pity that we don't see everywhere, but it's getting better.
Cool. Thanks very much, Lynn. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.